I believe he had something to say to all of us everywhere in the world, in all truth, because the films that were nominated with me all wished for the same thing. All their makers wanted to say the same thing. And in all truth, it is not me, or even Ben or Jack or Billy, that you truly honor. You honor Mahatma Gandhi and his plea to all of us to live in peace.
When Richard Attenborough had turned to Jawaharlal Nehru while researching for Gandhi, Nehru had one piece of advice for the director of the film.
Who said to me, make a film, don't deify him. That's what we've done in India. He's too great a man to be deified, but make a film about him. He was a man, not a god or a saint. Make a film.
I just began to get really puzzled about the thing. Gandhi was saying that caste is the most genius thing and it was the best part of Hinduism, and of course the world thinks that he fought against caste. Right. But what he did was he supported caste.
Because of the popularity of the narrative about Gandhi and the halo effect on him, we are almost always left with narratives painted black or white, where much of the grayer nuances have gone missing. He is deified to the point of dehumanization, and it's difficult for us to comprehend that there are parts of his personality that were human, which our collective memories choose to ignore.
And there has been a very distressing misrepresentation of history by the court historians.
Gandhi is a figure of intense debate and argument, and actually, as I've written in the past, that if you write any kind of scurrilous book on Gandhi, it will never be banned, because there's no one there to defend it.
But his legacy is changing in some parts of the world. This statue was removed from a university in Ghana after students rallied against it, or because they say that Mahatma Gandhi was racist.
Richard Attenborough for Gandhi.
It's safe to say that this narrative wouldn't have sat well with the largely Western audience that was consuming Richard Attenborough's version of Gandhi.
Alex, as he comes in, you speak to him, right?
It is for this precise reason we have these disclaimers in films, and as Ramachandra Guha puts it rightly,
I think never believe a feature film.
Gandhi's most celebrated biographer, Louis Fisher's 1950 biography, heavily inspired Richard Attenborough's on-screen portrayal of the peace-loving, soft-spoken, spiritual leader Gandhi. While Fisher's biography tends to be mostly positive, it does point out the moral ambiguity of the man.
Take 1-8, camera only.
In the movie Gandhi as well, we see a rare glimpse of Gandhi's more human side here.
All right, then go. You don't belong here. Go. Leave the ashram. Get out. All together we don't. Go.
Have you no shame? I'm your wife.
Now hold on. I'm getting ahead of myself, and as Mr. Guha rightly puts it,
I think never believe a feature film.
So this is what came to be referred to as the chamberpot incident in history books. In 1898, a new Christian clerk named Vincent Lawrence had joined Gandhi's Beech Grove villas in Durban, South Africa. He did not know the prevailing practice of cleaning one's own chamber pots at the villa, and Gandhi did not enlighten him. Kasturba was ordered to clean his chamber pot. Vincent Lawrence was of the Panchama class, and Kasturba found it revolting to clean his chamber pot or let her husband attend to it. And then this is pretty much how it played out.
And you will do it with joy or not do it at all?
Not at all, then.
All right, then go. You don't belong here. Go. Leave the ashram. Get out. All together we don't. Go.
Have you no shame? I'm your wife.
Owing to access to only Gandhi's account of this incident and Kasturba being largely non-literate, what we essentially get is Gandhi's eyewitness account. In his autobiography, The Story of My Experiments with Truth, Rajmohan Gandhi, one of Gandhi's grandsons, reminds us that we owe our glimpse of this unpleasant phase of the Mahatma entirely to Gandhi's own candid recollection. We can only assume most biographers might have wanted to squarely maintain a clear focus on the subject of their biographies, Mahatma Gandhi. Owing to the fact that most retellings of this incident is not Kasturba's own eyewitness testimony, it is in fact not her voice. It's then no surprise that none offer a perspective of Kasturba's version of the story, And it is not without reason.
You know, in the case of famous people, Rajdeep, you normally have letters written by them, letters written about them, but there are virtually no records on the spouse. So Kasturba's story has to be reconstructed partly by what Gandhi told us, partly by what others said, partly by inference. So that's a limitation to any biographer, that Kasturba was largely illiterate. She could read Gujarati, but she hardly ever wrote. So she didn't leave her memoirs, for example.
Lavanya Varadarajan's examination of the chamberpot incident in her study In Search of Kasturba, an autobiographical reading of the Mahatma and his wife, examines how various reconstructions of the event offer no perspective to Kasturba's version of the story. Her examination of various biographies documenting the incident helps us look through the perspective of known knowns, but more importantly, the known unknowns and unknown unknowns of this incident that are hidden between the lines. What's known is that Gandhi remains undoubtedly remorseful, dedicating an entire chapter in his autobiography to the incident titled A Sacred Recollection and Penance. Gandhi admits that he was a cruelly kind husband, one who regarded himself her teacher and harassed Kasturba out of his blind love for her. The deconstructions of the incident by various biographers show Gandhi as any common faceless patriarch in the Hindu society of his times. The biographers' exposure to Western ideas of gender equality at the time of writing their biographies can be assumed to have informed their perception and critique of Kasturba and Gandhi's relationship dynamics. For instance, Rajmohan Gandhi writes that this wasn't the first time Kasturba had seen her husband's domineering face, drawing attention to the fact that this was part of a repeated pattern. He adds on that these moments were mercifully short-lived, yet when they played out, Gandhi was master, teacher, husband, and she servant, pupil, wife. And indeed, a piece of property he owned and could dispose of as he pleased. Louis Fisher draws attention to Gandhi's temperament, stating that his subsequent Mahatma calm was a product of training. Gandhi incorporates a lesson for all of his readers in breaking the deeply patriarchal society of the time.
I hear that you also participate in preparing the meals and cleaning the toilets. Is that part of the experiment? Ba?
These biographers also point out that Kasturba didn't mind the task of cleaning the chamberpot itself.
I will tell Tara.
Rajmohan Gandhi writes that while Kasturba had acceded to cleaning the chamberpots of some of the other lodges, the prospect of carrying an untouchable's urine or letting her husband carry it was too much. Louis Fisher comments on Kasturba's orthodox worldview in saying that, in her eyes, the clerk remained an untouchable. What's interesting to note is how words have a profound effect in the various interpretations of this incident. Arun Gandhi observes the event as a sharp conflict, while Ramachandra Guha chooses to refer to the event as a disagreement, which sounds rather timid as Gandhi almost threw her out. Fisher's choice of verbs to portray the rising emotional cadence of the argument using Gandhi's protested and shouted as against Kasturba's screamed highlights Kasturba's ability to hold her own against her husband.
Have you no shame? I'm your wife.
But Fisher leaves out a crucial sentence when she asks whether she was supposed to put up with his cuffs and kicks just by virtue of being his wife, where Kasturba genuinely calls to question the nature of their marriage. In describing Kasturba, Gandhi often valorized her endurance in situations where she tried to exert her free will. This has confined Kasturba in a stereotypical mold of a devoted, self-sacrificing, virtuous wife and mother.
That we may ever live as friends.
You are my best friend, my highest guru, and my sovereign lord.
Gandhi, in his autobiography, points out that Kasturba could not bear the idea of Gandhi cleaning the pot. Gandhi's desire that she complete the task cheerfully or not do it at all seemed to have incensed her further.
Not at all, then.
What really bothered Kasturba remains a known unknown. Arun Gandhi, in his biography on Kasturba, is perhaps the only one that is compassionate and detailed to Kasturba's perspective. He notes that Kasturba deeply resented the fact that she had been asked by her own husband to defile herself in this manner and wondered how one so respectful of everyone else's religious convictions could be so heedless of those held by his own wife. There's virtually no evidence on Kasturba's perception of this breach of her orthodox worldview in which she had been raised. Was Kasturba compelled to sacrifice her own caste ethics so that her husband was spared from the inconvenience of cleaning the chamber pot and polluting himself? Did Kasturba clean the pots out of a genuine desire to participate in her husband's caste reform? Whether she even had an option not to be co-opted into Gandhi's worldview, considering how she was living away from home in a foreign land.
And I must rake and cover the latrine.
The answers to these questions, owing to lack of Kasturba's perspective on the incident, remain unknown. Arun Gandhi views the incident at the outset as a sharp conflict between Kasturba's loyalty to her husband and the traditions in which she had been nurtured. However, due to the lack of clarity in the source material, Arun Gandhi too sadly doesn't explore the eventual resolution of the conflict, saying only that the couple was eager to forget their quarrel, and in order to think of the future, both parties vowed that it could not happen again. Well, there is this version of the resolution in the film.
Where do you expect me to go?
What's the matter with me?
You are human. Only human. And it's even harder for those of us who do not even want to be as good as you do.
What remains unknown is whether Gandhi, in an act of remorse, cleaned the chamber pot himself, or Kasturba cleaned the pot to return a status quo which the incident briefly unsettled.
Refer to a well-known contemporary American philosopher who elaborated the relationship between what we know and what we don't know. You got the point. Sorry, old joke. Donald Rumsfeld. No, I mean, I'm referring to, you remember in March 2003, Donald Rumsfeld gave the famous interview where he developed his thoughts on the relationship between known and unknown. Here it is, the quote.
There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know.
But here, unfortunately, the dialectical strength of Rumsfeld thinking finds its limit. Because did you notice that the fourth term is missing? We have known knowns. We have known unknowns. We know that we don't know. And we have unknown unknowns. It's so much outside our horizon that we even don't know that we don't know. What about the fourth term, which I claim is the most interesting one? Not the known unknowns, but the unknown knowns. Things we know, but we don't even know that we know them.
While the thought does sound absurd, how can someone not know something that they already know? A crucial documented unknown known fact that is addressed neither by the other biographers nor Gandhi is pointed out in Arun Gandhi's biography on Kasturba. He notes that when the incident occurred early in 1898, it was only a few months after Kasturba had discovered that she was pregnant with her third child. According to Arun Gandhi, the pregnancy was proving difficult, as a result of which Kasturba, tired easily, felt uncommonly irritable and yearned to be back home. Nevertheless, he says that his grandmother tried uncomplainingly to keep her household running smoothly. Author Neelima Dalmia Adhar, in her fictional work The Secret Diary of Kasturba Gandhi, which chronicles her life through a fictional perspective, she imagines Kasturba's thoughts on the chamber pot incident here. The persistent putrid sting, the nastily gash on my wrist where Mohandas had grabbed me and dragged me to the gate, the rap on my dignity, and the sting of salty tears on my chapped face kept me awake all night. Indeed, I was no saint, but Mohandas had become an abusive and cruel husband who had lost all regard for the one person he claimed to have loved the most. I felt suffocated and trapped. Historians and makers of historical fiction both try to piece the unknown unknowns in their incomplete narratives in their own ways. A historian builds a strong rationale to fill these gaps with well-informed guesses, makes arguments that substantiate these, and then arrives at reasonable conclusions.
They have to be based on the logic of causality and the reasonableness with which you're making connections. If B comes after A, you have to explain why, and not just assume that the two are interconnected.
On the other hand, a fiction writer or a filmmaker might fill these factual gaps with their own imagination. Despite history and historiography's best efforts, gaps such as the chamberpot incident do exist.
History is irrecoverable. I mean, we can't recover it. All we have are what it's left in its tracks, and we have to interpret whatever those tracks are.
Now, while this does sound scary, where this malleability of history succeeds is that it gives us enough margin to recontextualize history for our own good. Historian E.H. Carr explains that all historical judgments involve persons and points of view. One is as good as another, and there is no objective historical truth. What is history? Our answer, consciously or unconsciously, reflects our own position in time. Every voice that tries to depict or document history will be influenced by their own experiences and perspectives, and maybe put their own spin on these historical events.
मुन्ना कौन? मोहनदास करमचंद गांधी.
One of Rajkumar Hirani's goals in making this film about Gandhi was to revive an interest in Mahatma Gandhi, whom he felt was a figure forgotten in contemporary India.
कहते थे पागल हो गए? You understand? Mahatma Gandhi is the father of the nation. So there has to be a respect for him. You can't put him in a taxi and say कि बापू चलो घर जाओ, लेट हो गया. What are you doing with Gandhi ji? I said यार तुम लोग isolation में देख रहे हो फिल्म, but आप पूरी फिल्म देखोगे तो I'm propagating his concept of non-violence. ऊपर से लोग कहते थे यार ये क्या बोरिंग फिल्म बना रहे हो गांधी जी की. गांधी जी कौन देखना चाहेगा आज के जमाने में?
जिस राह पे तुम चल रहे हो बेटा, एक दिन पूरी तरह फंसोगे. उस दिन मुझे याद करना, मैं पहुंच जाऊंगा.
Gandhi's ideas of Satyagraha and Gandhiwad were repackaged in the form of Gandhigiri that became more palatable to a new generation.
बापू का मैजिक. बोले तो 100 साल पहले अपन की कंट्री में एक मस्त आदमी आया था, मोहनदास करमचंद गांधी. बापू ने हमें जीने का सही तरीका सिखाया था, पर आज हम सब भूल गए हैं. तुम ये समझो कि इस वक्त बापू अपन के साथ स्टूडियो में बैठे है. तुम्हारी लाइफ में कोई भी लोचा हो अपन को बोलो, अपन गांधीगिरी से सॉल्व करेगा.
People actually adopted Gandhigiri.
अरे रख लेना मामू.
Traffic police in Ajmer has turned to Gandhigiri to create traffic awareness among the city commuters. Traffic officials offer flowers to commuters and appeal them to not to violate traffic rules.
Rang De Basanti had a similar effect. Historical figures like Bhagat Singh and Chandrasekhar Azad had been brought to life and inspired a whole new generation.
This whole spirit of the martyrs of the past came into the boys today. And what would they do?
Our contemporary reality dictates how we hear these voices from history. Gandhi himself was a unique personality in the fact that he divulged most aspects about his private life to the public than we can claim for other figures in public light.
It's part of a very large and complex life lived in the open. I end my book with a quote from the poet Paul Valéry, saying that, all of us keep our lusts and manias to ourselves. Gandhi made even those public. Right. And if he kept anything out, the editors, the collected work, said by Professor Swaminathan, put it all there. And as a biographer, I've also published unpublished letters.
But even if historical figures did divulge all aspects of their life, just think about historical documentation and preservation of information itself.
I think we're losing, obviously, the past, but by saying that we're losing the past, the record of the past, we're saying that, in a sense, we're losing our own memory and sense of who we are.
Abby Smith Rumsey is the author of When We Are No More, How Digital Memory is Shaping Our Future. She began her scholarly career studying how information was purposely deleted in the totalitarian Soviet system. These days, she thinks we have a new kind of storage and retrieval problem.
It isn't permanent at all, and in fact, The thing about digital technology is you can inscribe something onto a computer, but you can't put it on a shelf and expect to pick it out at random in 50, let alone 500 years, and be able to read it. In fact, you won't have the hardware or the software to do that. So it's very fragile indeed.
In a library of Alexandria's quake, geomagnetically induced currents produced by coronal mass ejections from the sun can catastrophically damage the internet itself. The future might be robbed of answers to the most pressing questions of our times.
क्या होगा अगर हम एक टेबल फैन ले, उसके ऊपर तीनों पंखुड़ियों के ऊपर अनार लगा दे और फिर उन दोनों चीजों को एक साथ चला दे? तो इसमें सोचना क्या है यार? तो ये रहा टेबल फैन और इसकी पंखुड़ियों पर हमने लगा दी है 3 अनार। तो इन दोनों को एक साथ चलाते हैं और फिर आप खुद ही देख लो कि क्या होता है।
Therefore, the question is not whether a particular version of history or historian is biased. The question is in what manner are they biased. The next time you are in a history lecture or watching a biopic, just remember how much of our history is in the realm of unknown unknowns. What we must look for as careful consumers of history is to look critically and ask why we know the things we do know. George Orwell's 1984 contains a well-known phrase about history, and its importance is now more relevant than ever. He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past.
If you stick your neck out and you start talking about we're not sure who this gentleman is here. Plainclothes police officer, more than likely. So what we're going to do now, Rosemary, I'm going to toss it back to you in the studio. Natalie, you can just back up. We don't want to antagonize the situation, but this is what happens when you talk about Tiananmen Square.
25 years later, Lee's museum is waging a new protest against the erasing of history.
You know, in China, no one allowed to discuss about June 4th. Parents do not talk to their children about that. So there's a vacuum there.
也被抓起来了。我认为这种在中国的这种审查，他们已经细到了每一个人的头脑里面。比如说，现在出版的学生字典，自由的自，可以有这个自己自卫，但是没有自由。自由这个词在孩子头脑里边要消失，不存在了。
The past has always been and will remain a battleground. The security of our memory is at the heart of this battle, and we are almost always encouraged into the comfort of forgetfulness. James Baldwin has said in writing about America's history of slavery that history, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read. And it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. The disclaimer on consuming history then perhaps is that there have been, there are, and there will be known knowns which we know.
Centenary this year, 100 years. In November anyway, it'll be 100 years since the worst public health disaster ever to hit New Zealand. We were discussing just before, it's very funny, it doesn't get listed as one of New Zealand's great disasters. We think of things like, the earthquake in Canterbury or the Erebus crash or things like that. But this was an act of nature. After all, viruses come out of the natural world. And far more people died in this episode than in any other disaster in New Zealand.
Unknown unknowns which we don't know.
So I think it's a no-brainer that lessons from the last big flu pandemic should help us make better decisions when we face another one in the future.
Known unknowns which we know that we don't know.
And then for many years the world seemed to forget about it, preoccupied with the Depression, the Second World War.
And then there is this question of what we choose to remember with the unknown knowns.
And one of my particular hobby horses, New Zealand has hundreds of war memorials but no national memorial to the victims of the 1918 flu. 9,000 people died and there's no memorial to them. The public needs reminders to be educated about past disasters.
I hope you enjoyed the video and give it a thumbs up if you like. Subscribe if you're new to this channel, and this video took some work, and I would really appreciate it if you could share this with someone you think might find this interesting. Thanks for watching.